Hi everyone, this lecture is going to be about classical organization theory. Um, there is no sort of formal school of classical organization theory. I'll just put myself up here so all the words are visible. But it's a sort of collection of writings from mostly American, but some European industrialists who were working, um, oops, didn't mean to do that, who were working sort of in the 1900s, the early part of the 20th century, which was really a time when industrialization was going on. This is sort of after the Industrial Revolution, but we start to see factories, rapid periods of urbanization, people moving to cities to take jobs in factories. We start to see sort of the mechanization of labor, and people started to think about, well, how do we optimize these processes in a sense to make the most money? And of course, this is what contributed to some of the civil unrest that would culminate in the 20s with the Great Depression, because part of what factories did was concentrate wealth in the hands of a few industrialists, and created sort of a super rich class, and then a class of sort of everyone else. Um, it's interesting because there are some obvious parallels to sort of the things going on today. But what some of these writers did, we'll get to who they are in a second here. Well, some of what they did was to look to sort of how big organizations were run before them, and some of the ones that they looked to were military and paramilitary organizations. In a military organization, you have sort of command and control increasingly concentrated to the top until you have one person, a chief, or a chief of police, or a general, or something like a colonel or whatever, who is sort of responsible for all the actions of that particular unit. And we see this sort of concentration of power replicated throughout organizations in history and even today. Take a retail outlet, for example. In a retail outlet, you have associates who handle sort of the frontline work. Then you usually have a manager for a given area. Then there's maybe a store manager, an assistant store manager, and then a store manager. Then there's a district manager, and then maybe a regional manager, and then finally sort of increasing until you get to the CEO, or whoever is sort of the head of the organization. Universities are sort of organized in the same way as well. You have faculty who provide much of the day-to-day instruction and conduct much of the day-to-day research activities, which is sort of the front line of a university's work. They report to a chair or a dean or a department head or something like that, and then there are sort of increasing layers of authority and power until you ultimately get to provost and vice dean, and ultimately the president of a university. So we often, when we think about organizations now, that triangle shape comes to mind, right? And there was a point when that idea was very new, and that would be sort of in the time of classical organization theory. So there's a number of sort of notable theorists, and we're going to read Frederick Winslow Taylor's a portion of his scientific management text. It's just a chapter, just a couple of pages long. And then there are videos on the work that Max Weber did and Henry Fail did. But there are some other people who sort of contributed to the body of work that's known as classical organization theory. And they're Adam Smith, Charles Babbage, Daniel McCallum, and Luther Gulick. For our purposes, sort of Taylor and Weber are probably sort of the most important. And so I don't necessarily think you need to know what each of these different men said, with the exception of maybe Taylor. What I'll give you here in a few minutes is just sort of an all-encompassing sort of set of principles that sort of describes classical organization theory. So there are obviously a number of other disciplines informing sort of the thinking about organizations. And it really wasn't until probably the 1950s, long after the sort of heyday of classical organization theory, um, that the study of organizations sort of developed into its own discipline. But the men that we talked about here were drawing from sort of principles of economics and sociology and engineering and management. Remember, the other thing going on at this time is sort of rapid, rapid increases in technology and science, and people are starting to develop what's known as the scientific method. This idea that we can, through a deliberative research process, we can specify a question and then test it empirically. Before then, so the time period before then, which was known as the Enlightenment, this is sort of where reason developed. It was during the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment sort of paved the way for this sort of scientific thinking, like I said, where people could specify a question and then test it empirically and determine whether or not they were right or wrong. Prior to that, sources of authority were really vested in heads of state, the church, and whatever they said went. So there was no idea that there wasn't a belief that you could question this kind of authority. It's really, sort of the 1800s, the 1900s, that people started to realize that they could engage in sort of a process to discover sort of the best way to do something, or the truth about something like that. And this is what's really known as sort of the beginning of modernity. These are sort of big periods in which specific schools of thought developed. But so the other thing that's going on is, like I said, is the end of sort of a purely agrarian and cottage way of life. So you may remember back to stories you heard in your primary and secondary education. This idea of interchangeable parts. That was something that Eli Whitney developed when he developed the cotton gin. The byproduct of that was this thing called interchangeable parts. Before that, if you needed a part for a machine, you had to sort of find someone, a craftsman, who could custom make it. And it was probably expensive. It was probably arduous. It probably took a lot of time. But imagine now if you had a machine and a piece broke on it, and say a wheel or a sprocket, I don't know, a pulley or something like that. Imagine being able to just pull off any old part off of the shelf and install it and be assured that it could work. What that means is that machine is going to be back up and running and doing its job for you, or the person who owns it, much, much quicker. And that was a pretty revolutionary idea, this idea that things should be standardized, this idea that things should be interchangeable. I mean, that's really the best word for it. So obviously what it didn't take all that long was for people to start to think about using people as interchangeable parts. And I don't mean for that to sound ominous, but quite frankly, it does. And there's quite a bit of literature and art and movies and books that have sort of talked about the danger of thinking about people as interchangeable parts. If you saw it, it's a couple years ago, but the movie Snowpiercer it's a pretty dystopic movie. But when a piece breaks on this train, there's a person installed in its place. It's terrifying if you think about it. The movie Metropolis, which was an old movie, I think made in the 1920s by a guy named Fritz Lang. Same thing. There were sort of people who work to serve a wealthy class of people, and they're merely sort of cogs in a machine. If one person can't do his or her job, they're simply replaced by another one. So, like I said, I don't mean for this to sound frightening or scary, but in a sense, it kind of is, it sort of devalued the importance of humanity, and it devalued reduced a person to his or her ability to contribute to work, right, to do a particular kind of job. This all kind of started. Well, I don't know if it started, but Adam Smith was certainly one to argue for this, and so you may know Adam Smith's name from The Invisible Hand of the Market. That's sort of the quote that's famously attributed to him. Markets determine prices and the value of goods and services and things like that. But he was actually among the first to argue for the division of labor, and he showed that the division of labor increased productivity. And of course, when you increase productivity, what you're increasing is profit, and that's good for the owner, the owners of an organization. Adam Smith did this work with a pin factory. He showed that by if a person is responsible for making, or for performing all of the steps to make a pin, they could make a certain number in a given day. But if that person only concentrated on one step, I don't know how many steps there are to make a pin or how many there were in Adam Smith's time. But if that person only did one step, they could do it much quicker and with much fewer errors. What you then needed was a series of people each performing a step, and you would move that piece of work down a sort of production line. And that's, of course, what sort of Henry Ford capitalized on when he developed the assembly line in the early 1900s, I guess. Charles Babbage sort of took this a step further and argued for, he also argued for the division of labor, but then he also thought that the worker should be matched to a task based on his or her skill level. And so the implications of this are pretty frightening as well, because why would you have a highly educated, highly trained person doing something that could be done by a person who didn't require the same amount of training or something like that? And so Charles Babbage's idea was that you just train people on what it is they need to know, which cuts down on training costs or time, and then it allows that worker to do those tasks and develop a skill, a proficiency in that given task. Daniel McCallum has got sort of an interesting tie to Buffalo, but he was part of the New York and Erie Railroad. And he's actually the one who developed this thing called an organizational chart. And so he, sort of building on what was going on in the times, applied what Smith and Charles Babbage said about sort of the division of labor, and applied that to management. And so management, people responsible for overseeing and managing those frontline activities also had sort of specialized tasks. And then he was a big advocate of reporting systems. Like I said, he developed the organizational chart. This, of course, is the organizational chart from for UB. It's a few years old now. I couldn't find a sort of better one, but you sort of see authority and hierarchy and responsibility, right, sort of concentrated up at the top, and reporting structure, reporting sort of crests towards the top. So Henry Fayle was a French engineer. His work really didn't make it across the Atlantic until really 1949. But and so that's really, it's fairly late in the sort of course of the development of classical organization theory. But he had sort of identified tasks for each organization. They were technical, commercial, financial, security, accounting, and managerial. This has to do with the making of products. This has to do with marketing and selling the products. This has to do with the finances of the organization. This has to do with like intellectual property security and things like that. This has to do with how we account for sales, and then, of course, all of these things have to be managed, and that's what he was talking about. So he really articulated sort of 14 principles, and I won't talk about each one of them because that's one of the videos for this week. We'll sort of talk about them, but what's sort of important to note about each of these is that we're breaking things down into sort of smaller and smaller tasks that it's increasingly easy to see whether they're done correctly, whether they're done right or whether they're done wrong. And so we're really taking the gray, right, the shade of gray out of any particular task to be able to determine if something is done right or wrong, or something is done in, for the good of the organization or not for the good of the organization. And so this uncertainty, this risk, might be a good thing in terms of, if your end goal is to make money or to sell lots of a product or to grow a company or something like that. But like I said, it has sort of some disheartening principles in terms of what it means for humanity and the humanness of an organization. So the I don't know if we could call him the most prominent. I guess he's maybe one of the most prominent figures in classical organization theory. But Frederick Winslow Taylor was sort of the first of the efficiency experts, I guess you might call him. He was a big advocate for what he called scientific management. It was called Taylorism at some point. And what this meant is that we could sort of engineer a way, or an organization could engineer a single best way to do a process. So if you've ever known anyone who's worked in a factory or had to do sort of repetitive tasks or something like that, they'll do like efficiency studies, and they'll watch a person perform a task and then figure out how to make the performance of that task more efficient. And of course, what do I mean by that when I say more efficient? Well, quicker. And so, maybe it's, instead of, turning from right to left, it's turning from, left to right, or, instead of moving something, 6 feet one direction, you move it 3 feet one direction, it's hard to see an example here when the camera doesn't quite capture all of my psychomotor activity. But, if something needed, let's say, 10 drops of lubricant, well, could you get away with 8 drops of lubricant if you were, machining a part or something like that? I mean, there's thousands and thousands of different kind of examples of efficiency studies and things like that. And they do them even now. And of course, like I said, the point of that was to make repetitive processes, more efficient. And by more efficient, the byproduct of that is that it reduces costs, it increases output, and ultimately drives profit for the owner or shareholders of that particular corporation. Now, Taylor was working in a machine shop when he was, I believe he was managing a machine shop when he sort of developed these principles. He was a religious man. He was heavily puritanical, and he believed that work, idle hands will do the devil's work, is sort of a puritanical kind of cliche. But he believed that work was noble, and it helped pave the way to salvation and religiosity and sort of God's kingdom. So he had very strong religious beliefs that sort of influenced his work, and he believed that by helping workers work more efficiently, he was actually proselytizing, sort of bringing them closer to God, so to speak. So as I said, he mentioned that there was one best way to produce this task. And in the reading for this week, he talks about an example of a worker who needed to load pig iron onto a railroad cart. I don't really know what pig iron is. I don't know that I've ever really seen it. I did Google it at some point, and it's the material uh, that's produced in an intermediate step on the way to producing steel. So um, so I would imagine it's metal-like and maybe bulky, maybe heavy, maybe oddly shaped. Each piece sort of has a unique shape. But in the chapter that we read for this week, there's a worker who has to load this pig iron, like I said, this intermediate product on the way to producing steel, has to load this onto a railroad cart. Um, and the picture that Taylor paints in this writing is that before he came along, it was just sort of mayhem. People were sort of jostling and shoving and struggling to sort of load the material onto this railroad cart in sort of an organized and efficient way. And Taylor says, well, if we do it this way, if you work in sort of chunks of this length of time and then take a break, you'll be able to get more done and I'll pay you more. Now, what's interesting to note, and you'll see this when you read it, is the increase in productivity is not commensurate with the increase in pay. He does pay the man more. He says he'll pay him more, but the amount of additional work he gets out of him is not the same as the amount of additional money he's getting from him. So what's like I keep saying the word dehumanizing here in this lecture, but what's sort of dehumanizing about this is he's actually getting more work out of the man in the story, the laborer in the story, and he's not compensating him in the same way. So the man is actually doing more work for less money. And like I said, that's just sort of this dehumanizing aspect to the way we started to organize labor and work in organizations here. I don't know. I don't know that Taylor was a particularly nice guy. He certainly would have looked down on people that were below him, him in terms of his station in life. So he was sort of a wealthy manager, owner, thinker, kind of thing, and he would have thought poorly of the sort of lowest level of laborer, and like I said, he viewed making them increasing their efficiency in their work as a form of proselytizing. So when it comes to sort of scientific management, these are sort of the key principles that Taylor saw. He thought that the task could be studied and the most efficient way to do it could be developed. And these exist today in terms of efficiency studies and things like that. He also thought that workers could be selected and trained to do specific tasks. That sort of builds on the idea that we said a few minutes ago of Charles Babbage and even Adam Smith. He believed that there should be cooperation between managers and workers, so that it shouldn't be sort of confrontational or confrontational, I guess is the best word for it. But then he also thought that supervisors were responsible for a worker's output, and it was up to the supervisor to ensure that a worker met his or her sort of set of daily or weekly output tasks. Max Weber is sort of the other sort of prominent name in terms of classical organization theory. Max Weber was a German citizen. He was raised in a wealthy household, and so he had sort of the leisure time to study and think, attend university, and become a thinker that would have been appropriate, for someone in his sort of socioeconomic status. But he Max Weber's output was by and large about, at least where we're concerned, is by and large about the issues of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy simply refers to the structure of an organization. In fact, if you think back to that organizational chart from a couple of slides ago, that in a sense is a picture of the bureaucracy. And you could expand that to include all of the workers, all of the people underneath those different managers and leaders, and the bureaucracy would become even larger. So Max Weber discovered that people who are higher in the bureaucracy have more knowledge, and they have more responsibility as well. And a bureaucracy really is intended to accomplish specific tasks. It's a structural arrangement of workers, but so it sort of defines areas of responsibility. It sort of creates clear lines of supervision. It forms the basis of power. So people who are more powerful because they're higher up in the bureaucracy have that power because it's sort of written into the processes and the policies of the organization. Managers were sort of some of the knowledge holders, and managers, there were managers who manage managers. He also noted that bureaucracies are stable. Although they may be inefficient, they're often predictable, and as long as a person follows the rules of the bureaucracy, things will get done. That is true with even bureaucracies like universities. People may be very, picky about signatures and the order in which things are done, but as long as those things are done, things are processed and sort of work is done. Weber also had a set of kind of administrative rules, and he was actually one of the first to think or to sort of make the point that managing is its own skill set, and there should be a sort of a profession of people who who specialize in managing, and they should be paid accordingly. They should be managing is important work, and so their pay should be commensurate with the sort of importance of their work. Weber also thought that managers are sort of what contribute to the administrative stability, and they're good for an organization. So what are the core tenets of sort of classical organization theory? And so this is what I would think is what you should take away and use for the discussion for this week. So core tenets: there's one best way to accomplish a task, a single best way. So that's the first principle, and that sort of comes directly from Frederick Winslow Taylor. Second principle is that organizations exist to accomplish a goal. Often it's an economic or a production goal, and that certainly was true in the context in which classical organization theory was developed. In the case of nonprofit, human service, social service, healthcare organizations that employ social workers, an organization exists to accomplish some kind of social or health-related goal. But all of the efforts of that organization are sort of, united towards accomplishing or moving towards that particular goal. So in order to achieve that goal, though, one of the most useful things organizations have are a specialization of labor and a division of labor. Now here's the last sort of core tenet and principle, and I'll explain this here just for a second. Classical organization theories believed that organizations and people always act rationally. So take Taylor, for example, Frederick Winslow Taylor. He was able to motivate the man loading the pig iron onto the freight car, the train car, by giving him more money. That's a rational. That's a sort of a rational proposition right there. I will increase your pay by X if you do Y. And I am certain that Frederick Winslow Taylor found this to be true throughout his life. He could motivate people by paying them more. Again, that's that's a very good sort of rational principle. What we'll see in the coming weeks, though, is that people aren't always rational, and bureaucracies themselves are not always rational. So at this point in history, we accept, or at this point, sort of in our in our thinking about organizational theories, we accept that people are rational and organizations are rational. But we are obviously going to have to challenge that in the coming weeks as we start to think about other organizational theories. So what does all this mean in terms of administration and leadership? Well, span of control is very narrow, and that's that whole division of labor as applied to managers kinds of things. So managers are responsible for a specific group of people doing a specific thing. And people have a very small contribution to the delivery of an overall product. Like Adam Smith said, you can get more work out of a person if they're only contributing to one point in the making of a pin. You simply need more people doing additional steps to complete the product. Like I said, this also devalues people. It's really dehumanizing. There's this, people simply become cogs in a machine. You were, in a sense, thinking about people as interchangeable parts. That's part of that sort of. Oops, didn't mean to go that far. That sort of, builds on this rationality principle here. This is why. The classical organization theorists believe that organizations are rational too. And what this really means is that leadership is transactional. It's about accomplishing a task. It's about accomplishing a task in exchange for compensation or praise or a combination of both. So leaders are not tasked with developing people, right, and helping them maximize their potential. What they're tasked with doing is making sure people achieve their production and output goals. So, like I said, it's sort of this we're at sort of a dehumanizing point in the history of thinking about organizations. And obviously, we come to realize in later theories here, we'll come to realize sort of the importance of people and the sort of importance of treating people like people, but that'll have to wait for another week. So thank you as always for watching. Any questions, feel free to get in touch.